The champagne tower shattered the exact second the blind boy screamed across the charity hall. Dad, hundreds of guests froze. Crystal rained onto marble floors. Cameras swung toward Sadiq Diallo, the feared billionaire CEO who had spent 10 years hiding the humiliation that he could never father a child. The small boy pushed through the crowd with a white cane, tears running down his face, and grabbed Sadiq's hand like he had known it forever. "You came back," he whispered. Sadiq's breath stopped. Across the room, his elegant wife Zahara turned pale and dropped her glass. Then the boy said 5 words that shattered every lie in the building. "Mother said you'd know me. What would you do if a child suddenly called you parent in front of the whole world? Comment your country and local time below. And if you love emotional stories full of twists, justice, and healing, subscribe so you don't miss the next part." For 3 full seconds after the boy said it, the ballroom stopped breathing. Not quiet, not calm. Stopped. The orchestra at the far end of the hall faltered into silence. A violinist lowered her bow. The servers froze beside silver trays. Wealthy donors stood in glittering gowns and custom suits, with their mouths half open, their faces glowing under the white blaze of chandeliers, as if the truth itself had just cracked through the ceiling. Sadiq Diallo did not move. The child's small hand was still wrapped around his wrist. It should have meant nothing. A frightened boy in a crowded room. A stunt. A mistake. A trap. But Sadiq could not force himself to pull away. The hand clutching him was trembling, not like a child performing, like a child who had finally found the last person left in the world. The boy's fingers slid across the expensive fabric of Sadiq's sleeve, then over the cold edge of his watch. He inhaled sharply, as though the metal itself had confirmed something to him. "It's you," the boy whispered again. Voice breaking. "I knew it." That was when the room came back to life. Flashbulbs exploded, voices rose at once. "Who is that child? Did he say Dad? Is this some kind of scandal?" "Get security." The sound hit Sadiq all at once, but what reached him first was not the crowd. It was Zahara. Sadiq, his wife, said sharply, crossing the marble floor with a smile so strained it looked painful. "Let the staff handle this." Her voice was soft enough for the guests to miss the steel in it, but Sadiq heard it, and so did the boy. The child flinched. That tiny movement was enough to make something cold shift inside Sadiq's chest. He looked down fully for the first time. The boy was perhaps 8 years old, small for his age, dark skin, thin shoulders, a clean white shirt too cheap for a room like this. A cane had fallen beside his foot. His eyes were clouded, unfocused, beautiful, and heartbreaking all at once. He was blind. Completely blind, Sadiq guessed. Yet his face was lifted toward him with such certainty that it unsettled the entire foundation of the moment. Sadiq's jaw hardened. "Who brought him in here?" he asked. Nobody answered immediately. Zahara did. "Does it matter?" she said, still smiling for the cameras. "He should not be here." The boy's fingers tightened. "He came," the child said quietly, as if correcting her. "I knew he would come." Sadiq felt every stare in the room turn sharper. He hated public disorder, hated emotional performances, hated being cornered. His entire empire had been built on control so absolute that even his enemies spoke of him like weather, cold, powerful, and impossible to fight. But this was different, because the boy was crying, and because Sadiq had seen those tears before, not on this child, on another face, another life, another name he had forced himself not to think for years. He tore his hand away at last. "Who are you?" he demanded. The boy blinked, still facing him. "Tendai." "And who told you to call me that?" "My mother." Sadiq's expression darkened. "Your mother told you I was your father?" "Yes." A ripple tore through the ballroom. Zahara stepped closer. "This is enough." But Sadiq lifted one hand, silencing her without taking his eyes off the child. "What is your mother's name?" The boy's mouth trembled. He seemed suddenly confused, not by the question, but by the pain behind it. She was Amina. The name landed like a blade. Sadiq's body went still in a new way. Not shocked for the crowd, not angry for appearance. This was older, deeper, a private wound opening under public light. No one around him understood what had just happened. Not the reporters, not the donors, not the board members whispering behind polished glasses. To them it was simply a name. To Sadiq it was an earthquake. Amina. Amina with the laugh that always began in her eyes before it touched her mouth. Amina who smelled like rainwater and orange peel. Amina who had once stood barefoot beneath a leaking roof and told him that poverty frightened her less than living unloved. Amina who had disappeared. Amina who had broken him. His face became unreadable. Zahara saw the change, and for the first time that evening real fear flickered across her features. "Sadiq," she said in a lower tone, "this is not the place." But Tendai lifted his chin again and spoke directly into the silence. She said, "If I found the man with the storm watch, he would know me." The blood drained from Sadiq's face. His hand went involuntarily to the watch at his wrist. A custom watch, matte black. Rare. Elegant. On the surface, nothing strange. But hidden inside it was a tiny mechanical feature no one knew about except two people. When pressed a certain way, it played the soft, recorded sound of rain striking a tin roof. Years ago, when he had nothing but ambition, and Amina had nothing but courage, he had given it to her as a promise. So she would always hear rain, he had said, even in the dry season. Sadiq stared at the boy. Nobody else in that room could possibly know that. Nobody. Zahara's lips parted. For the first time, her composure cracked completely. Tendai, a female voice suddenly cried from the doorway. Heads turned. An older woman in a faded blue dress stood there, panting, a headscarf slipping loose around her shoulders. Her sandals were dusty. Her fear was immediate and real. She looked like someone who had run through half the city. "Tendai," she cried again. "Come away from there." The boy did not move. The woman rushed forward, mortified by the cameras, the wealth of the attention. She bowed her head halfway toward Sadiq without really looking at him. "I'm sorry, sir," she said breathlessly. "Please forgive him. He ran from me. He should not have come here." "Who are you?" Sadiq asked. "I am Chippo. I looked after him. Please, sir, he meant no harm." Tendai turned toward her voice. "Auntie Chippo, I found him." Those words were simple, but they were spoken with such fragile triumph that several people near the front visibly softened. Sadiq did not. Not yet. He had been manipulated before, lied to before, used before. His father had built half his life on strategy and the other half on emotional starvation. Sadiq had learned early that the world respected a hard man because softness was always where the knife entered, so he made his voice colder. "Take the child and leave." Tendai's face fell. The expression was not theatrical. It did not ask for pity. It looked like hunger learning disappointment. "But you listened," the boy whispered. Something ugly tightened in Sadiq's throat. Zahara stepped in immediately. "You heard my husband. Leave before security is forced to." "No," Sadiq said. The word cut across hers so sharply that even the reporters fell silent again. Zahara turned to him. What Sadiq finally looked at her. Her face was beautiful, flawless, disciplined. She had mastered the art of appearing concerned while calculating the value of every room she entered. Tonight, however, the calculation was slipping. He could see it. "Why are you afraid?" he almost asked. Instead, he turned back to Chippo. You said you looked after him, Sadiq said. Where is his mother? Chipo's eyes filled at once. The answer came not from her, but from Tendai. She died. The room changed. Not loudly, not all at once. But the cruelty of public curiosity suddenly collided with the undeniable fact of grief. Even the journalists hesitated. Sadiq felt the word strike him in the chest. Died. Amina was dead. His first instinct was denial. His second was rage. At whom he did not yet know. At Amina for vanishing. At fate for bringing this into his life under chandeliers and cameras. At himself for feeling something he had spent years burying under work money and discipline. When he asked, 3 months ago, Chipo said softly. Tendai lifted his face toward Sadiq again. She told me not to be afraid, he said. She said when I found you, you would sound angry first. But that was only because your heart had been lonely too long. The sentence hit harder than any accusation could have. Because that was Amina. That was exactly the kind of thing she would say. Sadiq's pulse thudded in his ears. He should have ended this. He should have walked away. He should have protected the company, the headlines, the dignity of the event, the rules that had kept his life in clean lines for years. Instead, he heard himself say something he had not planned. Bring him to my private office. Zahara spun toward him. Sadiq, now. There was no raising of his voice. He did not need it. The authority in that single word silenced everyone. Chipo looked stunned. Tendai clutched his fallen cane. Zahara's expression shifted from alarm to something much darker. As Sadiq turned away from the ballroom, the cameras chased him. So did the whispers. The infertile CEO. The blind boy. The dead mother. The secret past. And somewhere beneath all of it, like a door unlocking in the dark, one unbearable thought began to form in Sadiq's mind. If the child was lying, someone had trained him with impossible precision. But if he was not, then the life Sadiq thought he understood had already begun to collapse. The private office on the top floor was the only room in the building where Sadiq Diallo could usually hear himself think. Tonight, even that room felt too small for what had followed him inside. The city spread below the glass walls in a wash of gold and black Legos glittering under the night like a second sky. Inside the office was all controlled dark wood clean lines, leather steel silence. A place built to reflect a man who never allowed disorder to survive near him. And yet disorder had entered anyway. It sat now on the edge of a cream-colored sofa, a thin blind boy with dusty shoes and trembling hands holding a white cane across his lap like the last object in the world that still made sense. Chipo sat beside him, stiff-backed and visibly terrified, twisting the edge of her dress until her fingers had gone pale. Sadiq remained standing behind his desk. He had taken off his jacket, loosened his tie, pressed one hand flat against the polished wood as if it were the only solid thing left in the room. Zahara stood near the bar cabinet silent for once, though silence did not soften her. It sharpened her. No one spoke for several seconds. Then Sadiq looked at the boy and said, "Say it again." Tendai turned his face toward the sound of his voice. "What, sir?" "The thing you said in the ballroom." The boy swallowed. His fingers slid nervously over the rubber handle of the cane. "That my mother told me to find the man with the storm watch." Sadiq's chest tightened. "Not that part. Everything. From the beginning." Chipo made a tiny sound of concern. "Sir, he is tired," I asked the boy. His voice was not loud, but Chipo fell silent instantly. Tendai lowered his head, not in submission, but in concentration, as if he were searching through pain and memory at the same time. "She said," he began slowly, "that when she could not stay with me anymore, I must find you." Sadiq felt Zahara watching him. "He said she died," Zahara cut in softly. "Children misunderstand things when they are grieving." Tendai flinched. That movement again. It was small, Fast, easy to miss. But Sadiq caught it. He looked at Zahara. "Do not interrupt him." A flicker of irritation crossed her face before she smoothed it away. Tendai continued. "She said your name was Sadiq, that you would not know me at first, that you might think I was sent to hurt you." His mouth trembled. "She said I must not be angry because pain changes the sound of good people." The words landed with quiet violence. They were so painfully specific that Sadiq almost hated hearing them, because Amina would have said exactly that. Always searching for gentleness inside damage, always making excuses for wounds that should have been confronted. He had once loved that softness in her. Later, he had blamed it. Now, hearing it again through the mouth of a child he had never seen before, he could barely breathe. "When did she tell you this?" he asked. Tendai lifted his face. His blind eyes did not focus yet. There was something unbearable in the innocence of the gesture. "Before the fever got too strong." Chipo covered her mouth. Sadiq's jaw tightened. "What fever?" But it was Chipo who answered, this time tears already standing in her eyes. "She was sick for a long time, sir. Too long." She tried to hide it. "By the time she agreed to go to the hospital, they said—" Chipo's voice broke. "They said there was very little left to do." Sadiq stared at her. What was she sick with cancer? The room seemed to tilt. For years he had forced Amina into a sealed chamber in his mind. A name he did not speak. A memory he turned into anger because grief was more dangerous. He had told himself she had chosen someone else, chosen another life, chosen abandonment. Now he was being told she had died poor ill and hidden from him. No, not hidden. Kept. Something dark moved behind his ribs. "When did you meet her?" he asked Chipo. "I lived in the same building," she said quietly. "Amina rented one room after she came to the city with the child. Later we became like sisters." Came to the city from where Chipo hesitated. Sadiq noticed it immediately. "Answer." "Kaduna first," she said. "Then Kano. Then here." She moved often. Why Chipo looked down. Tendai answered instead. "Because men kept finding us." Silence flooded the room. Even Zahara looked at the child sharply now. Sadiq stepped away from the desk. "What men?" Tendai's fingers tightened around the cane until his knuckles whitened. "I do not know. My mother would hear voices downstairs and pack our things very fast. Sometimes at night, sometimes before morning. She told me not to speak to strangers. She said if anyone asked about my father, I must say I did not know." The office air felt suddenly colder. Sadiq's mind moved fast now, collecting, arranging, resisting. This was no longer just a public scandal. It was beginning to sound like strategy. Pursuit. Erasure. "Why did she never contact me directly?" he asked. But the question was no longer really for them. It was for the dead. Chipo stared at him with a pain that looked almost like accusation. She tried. That was all she said at first. Sadiq went still. "What?" She tried, Chipo repeated, stronger now because grief sometimes turned fear into courage. Many times. Zahara straightened. Sadiq took one step forward. "Explain." Chipo wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. She wrote letters. She called old numbers. Once she traveled 2 days just to stand outside one of your company buildings because she heard you would attend a launch event there. But security pushed her away before she ever reached the entrance. Sadiq felt something hot and brutal rise in his chest. "No, it is true." "No," he repeated harsher. "If she had come for me, I would have known." Chipo gave a broken laugh that held no amusement. "That depends, sir, on who was making sure you did not know." The words struck deeper than she understood, because Sadiq knew with sickening precision what kind of power surrounded him in those years. His father's power, his father's pride, his father's hatred of weakness, poverty, romance, and anything he could not convert into leverage. Across the room, Zahara finally moved. "This is becoming absurd," she said. "A dead woman cannot defend herself. A frightened child repeats stories. And now a stranger comes into our home, and suddenly every ghost in your past is supposed to become fact." Sadiq turned toward her slowly. "This is not our home," he said. "It is my office." Her nostrils flared. Tendai spoke before either adult could continue. She kept the watch. That sentence shattered the direction of the room. Sadiq looked back at him sharply. "What did you say?" "My mother kept the watch," Tendai repeated. "Not all the time. She hid it in cloth, but on nights when the pain was bad, she took it out and pressed it so I could hear the rain." Sadiq's hand moved to his own wrist again. The storm watch. Years ago he had commissioned 2 identical pieces from a small watchmaker in Dakar, one for himself, one for Amina. No one had known. No one had even seen hers except the 2 of them. The world narrowed. "What else did she tell you about me?" Tendai's face softened, and for the first time since entering the office, he looked less like a messenger and more like a child remembering love through someone else's voice. "She said you were not cruel," he whispered. "Only proud when you were hurt. She said you laugh less than you need. She said when rain hit metal roofs, you used to stop talking just to listen." Sadiq closed his eyes. Only for a second. But in that second, the office vanished, and he was 26 again, standing in a half-finished apartment with Amina. The electricity gone, the storm outside, loud enough to drown fear. She had laughed because he had fallen silent in the middle of an argument just to hear the rain. Then she had kissed him and called him foolish. When he opened his eyes, the present returned like a slap. Tendai was still there. Blind, thin, motherless. Calling him father. Sadiq forced his breathing steady. "How old are you?" "8. "When is your birthday?" Tendai answered without hesitation. The date hit Sadiq like another blow. It was possible. Too possible. No more than that, it fit with terrifying precision. Zahara saw the change in his face. He knew she did because her own color shifted. Very slightly. But enough. Sadiq turned to Chipo. "Why bring him now?" Chipo lowered her eyes. "Because Amina made me promise. She said if she died before she could reach you, I had to help the boy find you myself. I was afraid. I delayed. There were stories about your temper, about your wife, about powerful people around you." Her voice shook. But Tendai kept asking when his father would come, and when the rent ran out and the medicine was gone, and I knew I could not protect him forever. She broke down. I had no right to wait any longer. The office fell silent again. Outside, the city pulsed under the glass. Inside, Sadiq felt the first real fracture split through the version of his life he had spent years defending. At last he spoke. "Where is Amina buried?" Chipo whispered the answer. Sadiq nodded once. Then he looked at Tendai and asked the question he had been resisting from the first moment the boy touched his hand. "Why were you so sure it was me?" Tendai turned his face toward him and smiled faintly through drying tears. "Because he said you sound exactly like the man she loved. And in that instant, before evidence, before science, before proof, something ancient and buried cracked open inside Sadiq Diallo. Not certainty. Something more dangerous. Hope. Hope was the one emotion Sadiq Diallo trusted least. Hope made people reckless. Hope made them ignore patterns, warning signs, humiliations they would have spotted instantly if they had remained cold. Hope was what made young men believe promises whispered in dark rooms. It was what made poor girls believe rich families would ever welcome them. It was what made lovers wait longer than dignity allowed. And now, against every instinct he had built his life around hope, had entered his office wearing a torn white shirt and holding a blind child's cane. Sadiq hated it, which was exactly why he decided to verify everything before dawn. He gave Chippo and Tendai one of the guest suites on the executive floor and posted 2 trusted guards outside the corridor. He told himself it was to prevent scandal, to avoid the press, to keep control of the situation. But when Tendai hesitated at the suite doorway and quietly asked, "Will you still be here in the morning?" Sadiq heard himself answer, "Yes." The boy nodded as if that single word had fed him. Then the door closed and Sadiq turned away before something in his face could soften. An hour later, the top floor of the private medical wing belonging to Diallo Group Health had been sealed for an after-hours genetic collection. Zahara stood beside him near the elevator, flawless in a cream silk dress that made her look serene from a distance. Up close, however, Sadiq could see the tension at the corners of her mouth, the over-careful stillness in her shoulders. She had insisted on accompanying him. That alone meant she was afraid. "This has gone far enough," she said as the elevator rose. "A grieving child tells a rehearsed story, and suddenly you are dragging the family name into a laboratory in the middle of the night." Sadiq kept his eyes forward. "If it is a lie, the test will end it. And if the child is being used, then the test will end that too." Zahara exhaled sharply. "You are not thinking clearly." That finally made him look at her. "No," he said. "For the first time tonight I may be." The elevator doors opened before she could answer. The medical director, Dr. Imad Eze, stood waiting with 2 technicians in sterile blue uniforms. She was a woman in her late 40s, brilliant, controlled, respected for the kind of professionalism money alone could not buy. Sadiq had chosen her precisely because she was known for being difficult to influence, or so he believed. "Mr. Diallo," she said with a slight incline of her head. "Everything is prepared." Tendai stood nearby with Chippo, his hand resting lightly on the older woman's arm. He looked exhausted. The excitement that had carried him through the ballroom had burned off. What remained was a child fighting sleep, fear, and hope all at once. Sadiq went to him. The technicians stilled. They were not used to seeing him lower himself to anyone's height. But Sadiq crouched anyway. "It will be quick," he said. Tendai turned toward his voice. "Will it hurt only a little?" The boy nodded. "That is fine." Something about the answer pierced Sadiq unexpectedly. Only a child who had already suffered too much could say that so calmly. Sadiq straightened. "Take the samples." Zahara stepped forward at once. "Surely there is no need to frighten him tonight. This can wait until morning." "No," Sadiq said. Dr. Eze gestured toward the collection room. "We only need cheek swabs from both of you. The rapid comparison will take several hours." Several hours. Enough time for doubt to grow teeth. Enough time for memory to become accusation. Enough time for every ghost from Sadiq's past to circle and ask, "What if?" The swabs themselves were almost insultingly simple. Cotton labels, gloved hand signatures, sealed packets. Tendai did not complain. He sat very still. When the technician asked him to open his mouth, he did so immediately. When she apologized for the discomfort, he whispered, "It is all right." Then it was Sadiq's turn. He signed his name beneath his sample ID. His jaw locked so tightly that the muscles stood out along his cheek. He watched the tubes disappear into the hands of a lab assistant and felt a strange sensation spread through him. Not fear exactly, but the realization that his life had narrowed to one question and he could no longer pretend otherwise. When the samples were taken, Chippo led Tendai back to the suite. The boy paused before leaving. "Will you tell me when it is done?" he asked. Sadiq looked at him. "Yes." Tendai gave a small, tired smile. "Even if it is bad?" For one terrible second, Sadiq could not answer. Then he forced the word out. "Yes." The child nodded once and walked away. The corridor seemed colder after he left. Zahara folded her arms. You are becoming emotionally involved. Sadiq turned toward the windows overlooking the dark city. Is that a crime? In your position, it can become one. He gave a low, humorless laugh. You sound less like a wife tonight and more like a public relations lawyer. Her voice sharpened. Because I am trying to protect you. No, he said quietly. You are trying to contain something. Silence fell between them. It lasted just long enough to become dangerous. Then Zahara recovered first. You are tired, she said smoothly, and tired men see betrayal everywhere. Sadiq looked at her reflection in the glass rather than at her directly. Interesting choice of word. She said nothing. By 3 a.m, exhaustion had settled over the building like ash. The event downstairs had been shut down under the excuse of a security issue. Most of the guests were gone. Social media, however, was very much alive. Screens in the communications office lit up with headlines. Clips slowed footage of Tendai gripping Sadiq's wrist while Crystal shattered in the background. The story was already mutating into a national obsession. The infertile CEO. The blind boy. The dead mother. The hidden scandal. Sadiq did not look at any of it. He remained in his office with the lights-dimmed jacket-off tie, loosened one untouched glass of water on the table beside him. He had not sat down in nearly an hour. At 3:17 a.m., his head of security, Musa, entered without being announced. Musa was one of the few men Sadiq trusted without reservation. He had served with military intelligence before entering private security, and he possessed the disciplined silence of someone who noticed everything and volunteered almost nothing. You asked me to look into the caretaker, Musa said, and she is real. Chipo Ndlovu, 46, informal nurse, no criminal history. Financial records show small and irregular income. Rent overdue in her current building. No evidence of media coordination. What about the child's school for the blind off and on? Long gaps, likely because of money. Neighbors describe him as quiet, polite, sickly as a toddler. No father listed on formal records. Sadiq absorbed this. What about Amina? Musa hesitated. That was never a good sign. Speak. We found a death certificate under the name Amina Bello, Musa said. Issued 3 months ago. Late-stage ovarian cancer. Burial records match the cemetery Chipo mentioned. The room went still. So she was truly dead. Amina had not vanished into luxury. She had not started a better life. She had not chosen a richer man. She had suffered, moved, hidden, died, and he had known none of it. Musa continued more carefully. There is more. Sadiq waited. Amina changed addresses repeatedly over the years, too often for normal poverty alone. That pattern suggests she believed she was being tracked. Zahara had entered the office midway through the report without either man noticing. Now she stopped near the doorway. That proves nothing, she said. Musa did not even glance at her. No, ma'am. It does not by itself. Sadiq rubbed a hand once over his mouth. Keep digging. Quietly. Musa nodded and left. The moment the door shut, Zahara spoke. This is becoming obsession. Sadiq turned to her. Go home. Her eyes flashed. Excuse me, you heard me. At a time like this. At exactly a time like this. For the first time in years, there was no softness in the way he looked at her. No marital politeness. No strategic tolerance. Only distance. Her expression hardened. You think I am the enemy because I asked sensible questions? I think Sadiq said that you have been more frightened of a child than of scandal, and I would like to understand why. Color rose beneath her makeup. You insult me. Leave Zahara. She stared at him for a long moment, chest rising and falling too fast. Then she gave a brittle smile. Very well. Call me when you are ready to behave like yourself again. The door closed behind her with controlled force. Dawn began to grey the horizon. At 6:42 a.m. Dr. Ease called. "Mr. Diallo," she said. Her tone was neutral. Too neutral. "The rapid analysis is complete." Sadiq did not sit. He did not breathe. And there was the faintest pause. Then the words came. "There is 0% probability of paternity." The office vanished into silence. 0%. Not low, not uncertain, not inconclusive. 0. For a moment, Sadiq felt nothing at all. The result was so absolute that his body rejected it before his mind did. Then sensation returned in a violent rush. Heat, humiliation, fury, the sickening awareness that hope had just made a fool of him. He said only, "Send me the full report." When the call ended, he remained motionless. A few minutes later, there was a gentle knock. Chippo entered first, Tendai beside her, freshly washed, wearing the same shirt from the night before. The child must have heard movement in the corridor and guessed the answer was ready. He stood in the center of the room facing Sadiq, with a courage too old for his age. "Did it come?" he asked. Sadiq looked at him. This small, blind boy with his mother's echoes and impossible memories. This child who had dragged the dead back into the light. This child who, according to science, was nothing to him. "Yes," Sadiq said. Tendai's fingers tightened around the cane, and the words tasted like iron. "It says, 'I am not your father.'" Chippo gasped softly. But Tendai did not cry. He did not collapse. He only stood very still, his face turning pale in a way that made him look older, not younger. Then he shook his head once. "No," he whispered. Sadiq's jaw tightened. "The test is clear." Tendai lifted his face toward him, and what came next was not tantrum, not denial, not childish refusal. It was certainty. They lied. Sadiq went cold. The boy took one step forward, tears starting at last. "My mother never lied about you," Tendai said, voice trembling. "Never. Not once." And in that instant, instead of ending the question, the result made it far worse. Sadiq did not sleep. By 8 in the morning, the city had fully awakened, but inside the top floor of Diallo Group Tower, the night still seemed to cling to the glass and steel like a stain that refused to lift. The official DNA report lay open on his desk, its language clinical and final. Probability of paternity 0.00%. Every line on the page looked clean. Too clean. That was what bothered him. Not because science frightened him. Sadiq trusted hard evidence more than tears, memory, and coincidence combined. Evidence could be tested, verified, broken apart and rebuilt. Emotion could not. Emotion made people useful to liars. But this result sat wrong inside him. It sat wrong because Tendai had not reacted like a child caught in a lie. He had reacted like someone betrayed, and because all through the night, one fact had continued to scrape against Sadiq's mind until he could no longer ignore it. The storm watch. No lab report could explain that. Neither could it explain the way Amina's private phrases had returned through the boy's mouth with such precise tenderness that Sadiq's bones had remembered them before his mind did. Someone somewhere had either built the perfect deception or tried very hard to bury the truth. A light knock came at the office door. "Come in." Musa entered with a tablet in one hand and a paper folder under his arm. He closed the door behind him without waiting to be asked. That alone told Sadiq he had found something worth closing doors for. "What is it?" Sadiq asked. Musa crossed the room and placed the folder on the desk. "I reviewed every handoff from last night's test," he said. "Collection, labeling, transport, intake, analysis, authorization. And one part of the chain is wrong." Sadiq's eyes lifted. Musa opened the folder and turned it so that both could see the photographs clipped inside, time-stamped corridor stills, digital access logs, internal movement reports. At 2:11 a.m., Musa said. Tapping one image, the sealed genetic samples left Collection Room B in the custody of a lab runner named Ojo. He was supposed to move them directly to processing. Sadiq followed the sequence of images, but he did not. No! Musa flipped to the next print. He diverted to the administrative hallway for 1 minute and 43 seconds, long enough to make a handoff, to whom Musa slid over another still image. Sadiq's face hardened the moment he saw it. A man in a charcoal suit stood half-turned beneath the dim hallway light. His face was partly obscured, but not enough. Khalil Bako, Zahara's older brother, on hospital property. After midnight, in a restricted corridor, something cold settled into Sadiq's expression. How did he get inside? Executive authorization. Tag, Musa said. The entry was cleared under a spousal family privilege code. Zahara. Sadiq looked at the image again. Khalil was not a man who moved unless money or danger moved first. He was polished, educated, charming in public, and rotten underneath, in a way that even expensive suits could not hide from those who knew how to look. Sadiq had tolerated him for years because marriage often came with parasites disguised as relatives. But tolerated was not the same as trusted. Now the parasite was standing in the hallway where Sadiq's future had changed hands. What happened to the lab runner? Sadiq asked. He left the building at dawn and switched off his phone. Find him. I already sent 2 teams. Sadiq nodded once, then rose from behind the desk and walked to the windows. Morning traffic crawled below, tiny and obedient from this height. People were starting their days. Deals were being made. Lies were already moving through the city, wearing respectable faces. Behind him, Musa waited. Tell me the rest, Sadiq said. There is another problem, Musa replied. The lab that handled the rapid test belongs to Diallo Group Health on paper, but 41% of the operating contract is subcontracted to a shell supplier. Sadiq turned. Owned by Musa met his gaze directly. Bako Biomedical Holdings. For 1 second, the room seemed to sharpen around the edges. Then Sadiq gave a small nod, the kind he gave before destroying competition. So he said softly, My wife's brother had access to the corridor, access to the lab structure, and access to the sample window. Yes? And my wife insisted all night that I should not run the test. Yes. Musa rarely added opinion. This time he did. It is possible the report is real, he said, but it is no longer safe to assume that. Sadiq let that settle. Possible. That was the precise word. He did not need comfort. He needed precision. If the result was real, then someone had staged an elaborate emotional attack with impossible information. If the result was false, then the conspiracy extended deeper into his life than he had yet measured. Neither option was small. Another knock came lighter this time. Before Sadiq answered, the door opened and Zahara stepped in. She was perfectly dressed for the morning cream blouse, gold earrings, smooth hair, calm makeup. She looked like a woman who had slept well, which meant one of 2 things. Either she had nothing to fear, or she had spent so long living beside deception that fear had become part of her grooming routine. Her eyes moved from Sadiq to Musa to the open photographs on the desk. A subtle pause. Then the smile came. There you are, she said. I called twice. I was working. So early, Sadiq said nothing. Zahara stepped farther into the office. The communications team needs direction. The press is turning last night into a circus. I think it would be wise to make a brief statement. Something compassionate but firm. The test was negative. The matter is closed, and the company is focused on its charitable mission. The test was negative. The matter is closed. She said it too quickly, too smoothly. Sadiq studied her face, and for the first time in years, he wondered how much of his marriage had been performance from the start. He spoke mildly. "Did Khalil visit the medical wing last night?" The question landed exactly where he intended. Her expression did not collapse. Zahara was too trained for that. But one heartbeat passed before she answered. "No." Musa quietly closed the folder. Sadiq's gaze never left his wife. "Think carefully." She folded her arms. "Why would my brother be in your medical wing at 2 a.m? There it was. Not was he there, but why would he be? A small mistake. Most people never noticed such things. Sadiq made fortunes noticing them. He walked back to the desk and turned one photograph around. Zahara looked down. For the first time that morning, her face lost color. It returned almost instantly, but not before Sadiq saw it. "He came to check on me," she said. "I was upset. I called him. At 2 a.m. "Yes, in a restricted laboratory corridor." She held his gaze. He was concerned for his sister. Musa said nothing, but his silence became its own accusation. Sadiq's voice grew even quieter. "And the shell supplier linked to your family's company?" Zahara's chin lifted. "Khalil invests in everything. That proves nothing." "No," Sadiq said. "Not by itself." The echo of Musa's phrasing was deliberate. Zahara heard it. He knew she did. She looked from the photograph to the report on the desk, and then back to him. A different kind of caution entered her voice now. "Are you seriously suggesting my family tampered with a paternity test because of some street child and a dead woman from your past?" The contempt in the wording was slight, but it was there. Street child, dead woman. Sadiq felt anger rise cleaner than pain, easier to use. "You are very eager," he said, "for this boy to disappear. Because he is dangerous. How he destabilizes you." The answer came too fast. They both heard it. Zahara corrected herself at once. "The company. I mean, he destabilizes the company." But it was too late. Sadiq stepped closer, not enough to touch, only enough to make retreat impossible without making it visible. "And what exactly," he asked, "do you think happens if I am destabilized?" She stared at him. For the first time in their marriage, she did not seem to know which version of him stood before her, the husband, the businessman, or the man whose past was being pulled out of the grave. That uncertainty frightened her. "Good." She tried one last time. "You are tired," she said. "You are inventing enemies because grief and scandal arrived on the same night." Sadiq gave a short, cold smile. "No. I am discovering that enemies may have arrived much earlier." The words hung between them like a drawn blade. Zahara's phone vibrated. She glanced at the screen, then back at Sadiq. "Believe what you like," she said, "but the result is the result." She turned and walked toward the door with controlled elegance. Sadiq spoke before she could leave. "I am running another test." She stopped. Slowly she looked back. "With whom?" she asked. "Not your brother's network. Not my hospital. Not anyone you know." Her eyes sharpened. "That is unnecessary." "Then you will not mind?" Her silence answered for her. When the door closed behind her, the office felt different, as if a mask had slipped and never fully returned to its place. Musa waited a beat, then said, "Do you want me to watch her communications?" "Yes." All of them, Sadiq looked at the city again. "All." Musa nodded. Sadiq returned to the desk and picked up the report once more. The numbers had not changed. The ink was still dry and official and false-looking, in a way he could now no longer dismiss as paranoia. He set it down. "Prepare a second test," he said. "Completely outside our network. Independent chain of custody. Multiple redundancies. I know one lab in Accra and another in Johannesburg. Choose the faster one. Fly the samples personally if needed." Musa inclined his head. "Understood." And Musa, yes, Sir Sadiq's gaze dropped briefly to the photograph of Khalil in the corridor. Do not tell anyone. Not Zahara. Not legal. Not the board. Understood. When Musa left, Sadiq remained alone with the hum of the air system, and the weight of a life beginning to reassemble itself into something darker. He thought of Tendai standing still after the result, refusing to believe it. He thought of the child's exact words. They lied. Most adults said that when they could not bear the truth. But Tendai had not sounded afraid of truth. He had sounded familiar with lies. And that difference changed everything. Sadiq went to the guest suite himself. When Chipo opened the door, fear flashed across her face. Tendai sat on the sofa, both hands wrapped around a mug of tea he had barely touched. The boy turned toward the sound of Sadiq's steps. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Sadiq said, "We are doing it again." Tendai stood so fast the tea nearly spilled. "I told you," he whispered. Sadiq's face remained stern, but something in his voice had shifted. This time he said, "No one touches the truth except me." And for the first time since the report had arrived, hope returned, not soft, not foolish, not naive, but armed. By noon, Sadiq Diallo had already done 3 things he almost never did in the same day. He had lied to his board, he had ignored 12 calls from his wife, and he had cancelled a $1 billion acquisition meeting without explanation. Every one of those decisions would have been unthinkable a week ago. Together they would have signaled to anyone who truly knew him that the ground under his life was no longer stable. But stability had become a luxury. Truth came first now. By 1 o'clock, Musa had prepared a second DNA collection under an entirely separate protocol. No Diallo Group staff, no hospital chain, no internal courier system, no family-linked contractors. A discreet pediatric specialist from a private diplomatic clinic arrived with sealed kits and 2 independent witnesses. Samples would be flown that same evening to a certified lab in Johannesburg with direct chain-tracking duplicate processing and video documentation from seal to report. It was excessive. That was precisely why Sadiq trusted it. Tendai endured the second swab without complaint. He stood in the suite beside the window, chin lifted, one hand resting lightly on the back of a chair, while the pediatric specialist worked. "Done," the woman said gently. Tendai nodded. "Thank you." The specialist smiled sadly and moved aside. Sadiq had watched every second. When the samples were sealed, he signed across both evidence tapes himself. Then he watched Musa place them into a hard transport case with 2 coded locks. The moment the case clicked shut, Sadiq said, "Do not let it leave your hands." "It won't," Musa replied. The transport team left. The suite became quiet again. Chipo sat near the small dining table, twisting her scarf in her lap. Tendai stood where he was, still facing the window, though he could not see it. Sadiq remained near the door, feeling the strange pressure of being needed and distrusted by himself at the same time. He did not know how to speak to children. He knew how to negotiate, threaten, calculate, dominate, acquire, and punish. But children required something more dangerous than skill. They required tenderness, and tenderness left fingerprints on the soul. He looked at Tendai and asked, "Did your mother ever tell you about my family?" The boy turned at once toward his voice. "She said there were people around you who loved power more than peace." That answer was so exact that it made Chipo close her eyes. Sadiq went still, not because the words were dramatic, because they were precise. Amina had always spoken like that, never wasting anger, always cutting to the moral center of a wound. She named no one. Sadiq asked. Tendai shook his head. "No, only that I must be careful when rich people smile too quickly." Chipo whispered. "She was afraid all the time near the end." Sadiq looked at her. Of whom, I don't know all their names, Chippo admitted, but twice I saw men asking for her in the market, once in Kaduna, once here in Lagos. They never called themselves police. They only described her. Her hands trembled. After that, Amina stopped using her real surname in public. Sadiq's expression darkened. A surname can be hidden, he said. A child cannot. Yet they still survived. Chippo gave a tired, broken laugh. Because she was clever. And because poverty can make people invisible when wealth wants to look past them. That sentence stayed in the air long after she finished it. Sadiq knew it was true. Men like his father never saw the poor unless they needed to move them, pay them off, or crush them. Amina would have understood that long before he did. He left the suite a few minutes later, not because there was nothing left to ask, but because the answers were beginning to point somewhere he had avoided his entire adult life, backward, toward his father. By mid-afternoon, Sadiq was in the old quarter of Victoria Island, walking through a medical archives building that smelled of dust, bleach, and stale air conditioning. It belonged to a retired fertility and trauma specialist who had once treated the Diallo family privately for matters that never entered public records. Dr. Bemba Okonkwo. 72 years old, brilliant, discreet, expensive, and according to the few whispers Sadiq had managed to find, increasingly eager to avoid unexpected visitors. The receptionist had tried to say the doctor was unavailable. Sadiq had said only, "Tell him Sadiq Diallo is here to discuss the lie he sold my father." That had opened the door. Now he stood in a quiet consultation room lined with faded journals and locked cabinets. The blinds were half drawn against the afternoon glare. Dr. Okonkwo sat behind a narrow desk, his hands folded too carefully, his breathing just slightly too shallow. Age had softened his face but not erased the intelligence in it. He knew exactly why Sadiq had come. "What did you mean?" the doctor asked, by calling it a lie. Sadiq remained standing. 12 years ago, he said, you told me I was infertile. The doctor said nothing. You told me the injuries from my car accident had made it impossible for me to father a child. Still nothing. Sadiq placed both hands on the desk and leaned in just enough to remove distance from the conversation. I need you to choose wisely what happens in the next 60 seconds. The old man swallowed. I delivered the medical interpretation available at the time. No, Sadiq said. You delivered certainty. There is a difference. The silence that followed was heavy enough to reveal guilt. Sadiq straightened slowly. There is a blind boy in my care, he said. He may be my son. The doctor's face changed. Only slightly. But enough. Sadiq saw it. And once he saw it, he knew. You knew, he said quietly. Dr. Okonkwo looked down at his own hands. No, Sadiq corrected himself with terrible calm. Not everything, but enough to understand what your report was used to do. The doctor's voice, when it came, sounded older than before. Your father was a powerful man. Sadiq's jaw locked. That was not denial. That was confession opening its first door. What did he pay you? Sadiq asked. The doctor closed his eyes. For years, Sadiq continued each word colder than the last. I believed a woman I loved had betrayed me after learning I could never give her a family. I believed I was broken. I married according to strategy. I buried an entire future because of what you told me. I know. The words were barely audible. Sadiq's hands curled into fists. You know, Dr. Okonkwo stood abruptly as if sitting under the weight of this had become impossible. He crossed to the window, then stopped with his back turned. Your tests after the accident showed trauma, he said. Complications were possible. Temporary infertility was possible. Reduced fertility was possible. But permanent sterility was not certain. Sadiq felt the room constrict around him. Not certain, he repeated. The doctor nodded once. Your father asked me for a final written conclusion that would end debate. Sadiq laughed. Then a short, brutal sound with no humor in it. End debate, he said. About my life. He said the woman was unsuitable. Amina. The doctor was silent. He said she was a distraction. Sadiq continued, voice sharpening with every word. That she came from nothing. That her presence would ruin negotiations already underway between the Diallo family and the Bako family. There it was. Not love, not health, not concern. An alliance. Assets. Control. A marriage market dressed up as family honor. Dr. Okonkwo turned back slowly. Shame had finally reached his eyes. He said if you believed you could never have children, you would stop chasing a life that embarrassed him. Sadiq did not move. He had imagined anger would feel hot when the truth finally arrived. It did not. It felt freezing, as if every part of him that had once trusted blood, family, and legacy had been submerged beneath black water. You sold me, he said. The doctor's face crumpled. I was wrong. You sold me to my father's ambitions. I was wrong. The doctor repeated more weakly now. Sadiq stepped closer. And what did he do after that? Did he tell you no? Did he tell you he separated us? That Amina vanished? That a child may have been raised in fear because you gave a rich man the perfect weapon to destroy 2 lives? The old man's mouth trembled. I did not know there was a child. No, Sadiq said. Of course you did not. Men like you never ask about consequences once the invoice is paid. The doctor flinched. A heavy silence followed. Then, with the last of his dignity collapsing, Dr. Okonkwo crossed to a locked cabinet and removed a thin paper file. His hands shook as he brought it over. I kept copies, he said. Not because I was brave, because I was afraid. Sadiq took the file. Inside were lab notes, original fertility assessments, and a draft summary marked with annotations in his father's handwriting. One line had been circled in black ink. Uncertain long-term fertility. Recommend retesting after 12 to 18 months. Below it, in another hand, his father's hand, were 3 words. Too ambiguous. Rewrite. Sadiq stared at the page until the letters blurred. He saw then with awful clarity how a life could be murdered without blood. Not by bullets, not by poison, by edited truth, by signatures, by fathers who called ownership love. His voice when he finally spoke was so calm it frightened even him. Did my father ever tell Amina? The doctor looked stricken. I don't know. Did he threaten her? I don't know. Did he stop her from reaching me? I don't know. Sadiq closed the file. For a long moment, neither man moved. Then Dr. Okonkwo said, Mr. Diallo, I am sorry. Sadiq looked at him. That word had no value here. Sorry would not resurrect the years. It would not return the first kick of a child inside Amina's body that he never knew existed. It would not sit beside her hospital bed. It would not bury her with dignity. It would not give Tendai back one day of certainty. It is too late for your sorrow, Sadiq said. He turned and walked to the door. His hand was already on the handle when the doctor spoke once more. Your father believed lineage should serve power. He feared love because love makes men disobedient. Sadiq paused. Then he answered without turning back. No, he said. Love makes men human. That was what terrified him. He left with the file in his hand and ruin in his chest. By the time he reached the car, the sun had begun to sink. His phone buzzed. A secure message from Musa. Johannesburg lab confirms receipt. Full processing underway. Sadiq stared at the screen. Then he looked down at the annotated report that had stolen more than a decade of his life. For the first time since Tendai had called him Dad, Sadiq stopped asking whether the past had betrayed him. Now he knew it had. The only question left was how many people had helped. The result arrived at 9:14 p.m. Sadiq was alone when the secure notification lit up his phone. He had locked himself in the smaller conference room adjoining his office, not because he needed privacy from the building by then. Almost everyone on the executive floor had already gone home, but because the larger office still carried too many ghosts from the past 24 hours. The desk, the windows, the place where Tendai had stood and listened for truth like a child listening for footsteps outside a door. The city beyond the glass had turned dark again. One full day had passed since the ballroom, yet Sadiq felt as if he had aged years instead of hours. On the table before him lay the file from Dr. Okonkwo. His father's handwriting stared up from the page like evidence of a crime more intimate than theft. Too ambiguous. Rewrite. Sadiq had read that line so many times it no longer looked like ink. It looked like a knife. His phone vibrated once more. Johannesburg Genetic Institute. Verified report ready. Video chain intact. Access encrypted. For a moment he did not touch it. The strange thing about truth was that people claimed to want it until they stood one breath away from the version that could no longer be negotiated. Hope was dangerous. Lies were dangerous. But certainty could destroy entire identities in a single sentence. Sadiq pressed the screen. A code box opened. He entered the first key. Then the second. Then a biometric prompt. The report unlocked. He did not read the top first. His eyes went directly to the line his body had already begun to fear and hunger for. Probability of paternity 99.997%. The world did not shatter. That would have been easier. Instead, everything inside him went terribly still. He read it again. Then again. Same result. Same reference number, same chain integrity, same duplicate confirmation. There was no error, no ambiguity, no room left. Tendai was his son. His son. Sadiq sat down slowly, as if his legs had lost the memory of how to carry him. He placed the phone on the table, then picked it back up because distance from the result suddenly felt unbearable. A strange pressure rose through his chest and into his throat, sharp and hot and impossible to master. For years he had trained himself never to break in private, because men who broke in private eventually broke in public. And public weakness was currency in the hands of enemies. But this was not weakness. This was grief colliding with love too late. This was joy with blood in it. This was punishment. He bent forward, one hand over his mouth, and for the first time in more than a decade, Sadiq Diallo wept where no one could see him. Not neatly, not nobly. He wept like a man realizing that the child he had longed for in secret already existed and had spent 8 years in darkness, waiting for a father who had never come. He wept for Amina alone, with her illness hiding from men he had not protected her from. He wept for Tendai learning the shape of the world without sight and without certainty, holding on to his mother's stories, because stories were all that remained when medicine rent and time ran out. He wept for the years stolen by a father who had called cruelty strategy. And when the tears finally slowed, he did not wipe them away at once. He let them remain. He deserved to feel every part of this. A soft knock sounded at the door. Sadiq straightened too fast, but the movement came too late. Musa entered, saw his face, and stopped. Neither man spoke for a second. Then Musa closed the door quietly behind him and said, "It is confirmed." Sadiq nodded once. Musa did not offer sympathy. That was one of the reasons Sadiq trusted him. Men like them did not survive by decorating pain. They respected it by naming it correctly. "My son Sadiq said," and even now the words felt almost unreal. "Yes," Musa replied. Sadiq stood abruptly. "Where is he? In the suite with Chippo?" Sadiq grabbed the report file and his phone. Then he stopped, turned back, and asked the only question that still mattered beyond the result. Was the chain clean? Video from collection to arrival, Musa said. Dual independent processing. No internal contacts, no family access, no tampering. Sadiq nodded again. That meant the other report had been false, which meant Zahara's fear had not been hysteria. It had been knowledge, and Khalil's appearance in the corridor had not been coincidence. It had been intervention. Cold anger uncoiled under Sadiq's skin, but it could wait. Not long, but long enough. Tendai came first. The guest suite door opened before Sadiq knocked a second time. Chipo stood there in a plain blue dress, her face tense until she saw his expression. Then her hand flew to her mouth. "You know," she whispered. Sadiq nodded. Chipo's eyes filled instantly. She stepped aside without another word. Inside, Tendai sat on the carpet near the sofa, his cane beside him, his head bowed over a small wooden puzzle someone from the staff had brought earlier. He was feeling the pieces with careful fingertips, building the shape without sight. He turned toward the sound of Sadiq's steps at once. "Is that you?" The question nearly split Sadiq open again. Yes. Tendai rose quickly, one hand searching for balance. Sadiq crossed the room before the boy could reach for the cane. For one suspended second, they stood facing each other, one man who had lost years, one child who had lost far more. Then Sadiq crouched. He had imagined many possible versions of this moment while waiting for the result. In none of them had language failed him so completely. He held out the phone, then realized the gesture was absurd. Tendai could not read it, so Sadiq set the phone aside and placed both hands very carefully on the child's shoulders. His voice came out rougher than he intended. The first report was a lie. Tendai froze. Sadiq swallowed. The second one is true. Silence. Tendai's mouth parted, but no words came. Sadiq forced himself to continue. "You were right," he said. "They lied." His breath shook once. "I am your father." Chipo began to cry softly behind them. Tendai did not move. For a terrifying second, Sadiq thought the child might not understand. Then Tendai's face crumpled, not with confusion, but with a pain so deep it had waited too long for relief. "You came back," he whispered. No accusation, no demand, just the same fragile faith that had first reached for him in the ballroom, that undid Sadiq completely. He pulled Tendai into his arms. The boy was lighter than he should have been, too thin, too careful, and yet the instant he felt the embrace he held on with fierce, desperate strength, burying his face against Sadiq's shoulder, as if the body of his father was something he had already known by memory. Sadiq closed his eyes and held him tighter. "I am sorry," he said into the child's hair. "I am sorry. I am sorry I was not there. I am sorry I did not know. I am sorry they kept us apart." Tendai's small hands gripped the back of his shirt. "I waited," he said through tears. "I waited every time," she said. Maybe. Sadiq had survived boardroom coups, market crashes, lawsuits, political enemies, and one attempted kidnapping without once feeling physically weak. But those words nearly dropped him to the floor. He held Tendai at arm's length, just enough to look at him. The boy's blind eyes were wet. His cheeks trembled. His chin lifted in the direction of Sadiq's voice, the way flowers turned toward sun they could not fully see. "Why did it take so long?" Tendai asked. The question was small. That made it unbearable. Sadiq could have lied then, could have offered a softer version, could have hidden behind adult complexity. He did not. "Because bad people lied to both of us," he said. "And because I believed them too long." Tendai absorbed that in silence. Then, with the blunt moral clarity only children possess, he asked, "Will you leave again?" Sadiq answered instantly. "No. Not maybe. Not I will try. Not I should not. No." The certainty of it surprised even him. Tendai's lower lip trembled. promise, Sadiq took the boy's right hand and placed it over his own heartbeat. I promise. Tendai stood very still, feeling the rhythm beneath his palm. Then he nodded once solemnly, as if he had just signed a contract older and stronger than paper. Behind them, Chipo covered her face and wept openly now. Sadiq rose and drew Tendai with him. He sat on the sofa and pulled the child onto his lap. Not gracefully, not because he had practice, but because distance had already stolen enough. Tendai leaned against him as naturally as if he had done so all his life. Sadiq looked down at the boy's face. Amina had been there all along, in the shape of the mouth, in the softness that survived fear, in the way love was trusted even after abandonment had seemed to prove it foolish. But there was Sadiq in him too, around the eyes, in the set of the jaw when he braced himself, in the strange, quiet intensity that made even stillness feel deliberate. My son Sadiq thought again. This time the words did not feel unreal. They felt like judgment and blessing in the same breath. Tendai touched the front of Sadiq's shirt, then his throat, then his jaw, learning him the way blind children learned truth through patience and skin and attention. No sighted adult ever truly mastered. When Tendai's fingers reached the corner of Sadiq's eye, they stopped. "You were crying," he said softly. Sadiq almost laughed at the tenderness of being discovered that way. "Yes, because you are sad." "Yes," Sadiq said. Then he corrected himself. "And because I found you." Tendai considered that. Then very quietly, with all the innocence in the world and all the sorrow of a child who had lived too close to death, he asked, "Would Mama be happy now?" Sadiq looked down and could not answer for a moment. He thought of Amina in pain, holding on just long enough to pass hope into her son's hands. He thought of every letter intercepted, every warning buried, every lie signed in polished offices by people who called themselves family. At last he said, "Yes." Then more firmly, because truth deserved strength. "She would be proud of you." Tendai nodded and rested his head against Sadiq's chest. For several minutes no one in the room moved. Outside, the city went on. Inside, a father and son sat together for the first real time in their lives. The healing had begun. So had the reckoning. And while Tendai listened to the beat under his ear, Sadiq Diallo made a second promise in the silent part of himself, where decisions became destiny. Whoever forged that first result, whoever stole these years, whoever helped bury Amina in fear, would answer for it. By sunrise, Sadiq Diallo had become two men at once. One was a father who sat beside a sleeping blind boy and listened to the fragile rhythm of his breathing as if every exhale were a gift returned from the dead. The other was a man preparing to burn lies down to their foundations. He did not confuse the two. That was why he moved carefully. At 6:30 a.m. Tendai was still asleep in the guest suite. One hand curled around the handle of his cane, even in rest, as though life had taught him too early that safety was never complete. Chipo slept in the armchair nearby, her head tilted awkwardly to one side. Sadiq stood at the doorway for a long moment before quietly pulling the blanket higher over the boy's shoulder. Then he left. By 8, the executive war room on the 34th floor had been secured. Only 5 people were inside Sadiq Musa. The chief compliance officer, the head of corporate forensics, and an outside legal strategist who owed loyalty to no one inside the Diallo family network. Phones were collected at the door, screens were shielded. Every statement was recorded for chain of evidence use. On the center table lay the first DNA report, the second verified Johannesburg report corridor. Images of Khalil in the medical wing shell company ownership records, and 6 months of suspicious asset transfers flowing through accounts attached to Zahara's private foundations. Sadiq stood at the head of the table with both hands braced on polished wood. No leaks, he said. No warnings. No private calls. Anyone who tries to protect a name instead of the truth leaves this room permanently. No one tested him. They worked for nearly 3 hours. The financial pattern was uglier the longer they looked. Small movements at first, legal-looking transfers, advisory fees, restructuring costs, charitable allocations. Then larger ones hidden inside vendor rotations and debt-shielding vehicles. Zahara had not been stealing impulsively. She had been preparing. That detail mattered. Impulsive criminals panicked when exposed. Prepared criminals had timelines, and timelines meant the move against him had likely already been scheduled. The legal strategist slid a file across the table. There's more. Sadiq opened it. A board petition draft. Incomplete, but far enough along to be lethal. The language was careful concern about executive instability, reputational damage, emotional decision-making, shareholder risk, temporary transfer of voting control pending review. Attached to it were pre-commitment notes from 3 board members. Not enough to remove him on their own. Enough to trigger a fight. Sadiq read the final page and felt a grim, cold admiration. They were going to use the child, he said. No one answered. They did not need to. The structure was obvious now. If the false DNA result had stood, Zahara could have painted him as a compromised executive rattled by a public hoax, emotionally erratic, exposed to scandal, and unfit for temporary leadership. While he was forced into damage control, Khalil's network would tighten around the company's vulnerable divisions. A family ambush disguised as governance. Musa stepped closer and placed a tablet beside the file. There is another layer, he said. Your internal legal counsel. Sadiq looked up sharply. Which one, Bashir Lado? For a second, Sadiq said nothing. Bashir had been with the company for 7 years. Precise, discreet, tireless. He had handled hostile acquisitions, defamation threats, inheritance, disputes, and one ministerial investigation without once visibly shaking. Sadiq had not liked him personally, but he had trusted his usefulness. Proof, Sadiq asked. Musa tapped the screen. Encrypted message logs appeared metadata first, then reconstructed content from a mirrored device, accessed under emergency corporate authority. Enough to establish contact, enough to show sequence, enough to remove doubt. Bashir had been speaking with Khalil for months. Not daily, strategically. The timing mapped directly to the asset transfers and board petition drafting. Sadiq let out one slow breath. So the rot had reached legal too. Good, he thought suddenly. Not because betrayal was good, because clarity was. There was a savage relief in finally seeing the whole shape of a trap. What time is the quarterly board session? He asked. 9 tonight, said the compliance officer. Hybrid attendance. It can be moved if you want. No. Sadiq closed the file. We keep it exactly where it is. The strategist understood first. You want them to act. I want them confident. By noon, Zahara requested a private meeting. Sadiq allowed it. He received her in his main office, with the blinds open and the city blazing behind him. She entered in a structured ivory suit, immaculate as ever. Not a single visible sign of the pressure now tightening around her. But Sadiq no longer measured truth by surfaces. He offered no greeting. Zahara noticed the missing softness instantly. We need to talk, she said. We do. She came closer, searching his face. You have shut me out for 2 days over a dead woman's child and a manufactured scandal. Sadiq almost smiled. Even now she was trying to define reality before he spoke. He leaned back in his chair. Interesting phrasing. What phrasing? Not whether the child is mine, only whether the scandal is manageable. Her eyes cooled. Because I am thinking like your wife. No, he said. You are thinking like a claimant. Something flashed across her face. Anger first, then caution. You are insulting me again, and you are underestimating me again. For 1 second, neither moved. Then Zahara changed tactics. Her voice softened. Sadiq, listen to yourself. You have not slept. You found out your father lied to you. You are grieving a woman you thought you had lost years ago. Of course you want that boy to be yours. Of course you want a reason for all this pain. But desire is not evidence. Sadiq rose slowly from his chair. He walked to the window, then turned back toward her with a calm so complete it became frightening. You should have stopped at the first lie, he said. Her expression flickered. Too small for anyone who did not know her. Too large for Sadiq to miss. He took a folder from the desk and tossed it onto the low table between them. The first photograph landed face up, Khalil in the medical corridor. Zahara's face did not collapse. It tightened. Then he dropped the second page beside it. Shell ownership records, then the third, board petition draft, and the fourth. Bashir's messages. Now the silence changed. It was no longer defensive. It was calculating. How much, Sadiq asked quietly, were you planning to take before you declared me unstable? Zahara stared at the documents. When she looked up again, the mask had changed. Not gone. Changed. So this, Sadiq thought, is your true face. Not hysterical, not ashamed. Cold. You already had everything, he said. The name, the house, the influence, the respectability. Why this? Her jaw hardened. Because everything was never truly mine. The honesty of the answer almost amused him. There it is, he said. You want honesty. She snapped. Then hear it honestly. I lived beside a man who built walls higher every year. A man who offered wealth status protection, everything except intimacy, everything except trust. You married me because your father arranged it and because you thought children would never matter. You wanted a polished alliance, not a wife. Sadiq let her speak, because sometimes the guilty revealed more when allowed to justify themselves. She stepped closer, and then she continued, voice shaking now with something dangerously close to contempt. A blind boy appears, and suddenly I am supposed to watch you give everything, your empire, your legacy, your heart to a ghost from the gutter and her son, the gutter. Sadiq's eyes went flat. Amina had more dignity in poverty than you have ever had in silk. The slap landed without a hand. Zahara flinched as if struck. Then fury broke through. You think she was noble, she hissed. She was weak. Sentimental. The kind of woman powerful men ruin without even trying. Your father knew exactly what she was. Sadiq crossed the distance between them in 2 steps. Not violently, but close enough that she finally had to tilt her head up to meet what stood before her. My father is not your defense, he said. He is your warning. For the first time that day, Zahara looked genuinely afraid. Good, he thought again. Very good. At 8:57 p.m., the quarterly board session began. Some directors attended in person. Others joined on the secure wall screen from Abuja, Nairobi, London, and Johannesburg. Bashir sat 3 seats down from Zahara, composed and unreadable. Khalil was not present officially. He had no reason to be. But Sadiq knew men like Khalil preferred to hide behind outcomes, not minutes. The chair opened with routine remarks. Finance review, regional expansion, risk exposure. Then Zahara moved exactly when Sadiq expected her to. With respect, she said smoothly, before we proceed to voting matters, I would like to raise a governance concern related to recent events and their obvious impact on executive stability. There it was. Several heads turned. A few directors looked uncomfortable. One of the remote windows muted. Another leaned closer. Zahara continued with perfect sorrow. The public incident involving my husband has already caused severe reputational disruption. His subsequent behavior has been erratic, emotionally compromised, and materially risky. In the best interests of shareholders, I believe temporary supervisory protections should be considered. Bashir slid a packet forward. The petition. Right on schedule. Sadiq let the moment breathe. Long enough for them to believe the move was landing. Then he spoke. No, just one word. But the room felt it. Zahara turned. Sadiq, this is not personal. It is entirely personal, he said. That is what makes it criminal. He pressed a control on the table. The main screen changed. First came the Johannesburg DNA report. Certified. Time-stamped. Chain verified. Probability of paternity 99.997%. The room erupted. Zahara's face emptied. Bashir went still. Before anyone could recover, the next slide appeared. The first DNA report. Then corridor footage. Khalil receiving the sample handoff. Then ownership diagrams. Then financial diversions. Then message logs. Then the draft petition with internal legal coordination, metadata attached. Shock moved around the table like a storm front. One director swore under his breath. Another ripped off his glasses. A third said, "My God!" Sadiq remained standing. His voice did not rise. It did not need to. My son was used as the opening move in a corporate theft operation. A false DNA report was engineered through a lab network tied to my wife's family. Assets were diverted. Legal counsel colluded. Governance procedures were weaponized. And while a dead woman's name was spat on to protect reputations, the people responsible sat in this room pretending to defend the company. He turned to Bashir first. Security. 2 officers entered immediately. Bashir stood halfway, face drained. You cannot do this without I already have. Then Sadiq looked at Zahara. All her elegance remained, but it no longer carried power. Only exposure. You wanted me unstable, he said. Now you will learn the difference between grief and judgment. She tried one last thing. Sadiq, no. The same word as before. This time it ended everything. Your access is revoked, he said. Your accounts are frozen, pending criminal review. You will answer for every transfer, every forged route, every false statement, and every step taken to separate me from my child. The officers moved. Remote directors watched in stunned silence. And as Zahara stood there, at last, stripped of performance, Sadiq felt no pleasure, only justice. Cold, overdue, exact. The first reckoning had begun. After the board meeting, the tower went strangely quiet, not peaceful. Never that. It was the kind of quiet that came after impact, when glass had already shattered. Reputations had already broken, and everyone left standing was still trying to understand what had survived. Security escorted Bashir out through a private service corridor. Compliance officers sealed Zahara's devices and credentials. Emergency motions were filed before midnight. By morning, half the financial media in West Africa would be screaming about corporate fraud, family betrayal, and the spectacular collapse of a power marriage that had once been photographed as if it were untouchable. But none of that was what mattered most to Sadiq. Not tonight. Tonight, after the formal statements were drafted and the first legal instructions were sent, he went back to the guest suite. Tendai was asleep again. The child had curled onto one side beneath a light grey blanket. One hand tucked near his face, the other resting over the old white cane laid beside him on the bed like a companion. He still did not fully trust himself to live without. Chippo was awake this time, sitting in the armchair with a lamp on low, reading from a prayer book in a whisper too soft to disturb the room. When she looked up and saw Sadiq, she rose at once. You should rest, she said quietly. Sadiq glanced at the sleeping boy. So should you. Chippo gave a tired smile. I have rested more in this room than in the last 3 months. He believed her. The last 2 days had changed the air around Tendai. Not his blindness, not the years of uncertainty already built into his small body, but something else. The tension in his sleep had softened. The child who had once listened for danger in every corridor now slept under the roof of a father who had finally begun to understand the cost of absence. Sadiq stood beside the bed for a long moment, looking down. My son, he thought again. The words no longer felt impossible. They felt sacred. Chipo cleared her throat gently. There is something I did not know when to give you. Sadiq turned. She reached into the cloth bag at her feet and pulled out a flat brown envelope, worn along the edges, softened by handling and time. His name was written across the front in careful handwriting. Sadiq. The sight of it hit him harder than the boardroom had, because he knew that hand. Even before he touched the envelope, he knew. Amina. He took it slowly, as if paper could bruise. She made me promise, Chipo whispered, that if the boy ever found you, truly found you, I must place this in your hands and no one else's. Sadiq did not answer immediately. His thumb moved over the ink of his own name. The letters were slightly uneven, as though written in pain or exhaustion, but unmistakably hers. When did she write it, he asked. A few days before the end, Chipo said, when she knew she was not going to recover. Something inside him tightened so sharply it almost felt like fear. Not fear of what was in the envelope, fear of hearing her one last time. He looked back at Tendai. The boy slept on, unaware that his mother's final voice was about to enter the room again. Sadiq left the suite and went to his office alone. He did not trust himself to open it in front of anyone. The city beyond the windows was deep black, the streets below lit by late traffic and scattered rain. Actual rain had begun, a fine, steady fall, tapping the glass softly enough that for a moment he hated the sound. Amina had always loved rain. He sat at his desk and opened the envelope. Inside was a folded letter, 3 pages written on simple lined paper. He unfolded the first page with both hands, and then he read, Sadiq, if this letter has reached you, then life has already chosen the crueler road. I prayed for years that I would speak these words to you with my own mouth, not leave them in paper like a ghost. But if Tendai is the one who brought you this, then I need you to know first that I never stopped trying to reach you. Not once. Sadiq closed his eyes. Just for a second. Then he forced himself to continue. I know what you believed. I know what your silence must have turned into inside your heart. Maybe you thought I was ashamed. Maybe you thought I left because you could not give me children. Maybe you thought I chose an easier man, an easier life. None of that is true. His throat burned. He kept reading. Your father came to see me after your accident. Not himself at first. Men came before him. Men with polished shoes and dead eyes. They told me you needed peace, that your future had already been decided, that I was the kind of woman who would ruin everything if I stayed close. I told them I did not care about wealth or names. I told them I loved you. They laughed. Sadiq's hand tightened on the paper until it shook. He could see them. Men like that. Men his father always used when he wanted dirt removed without ever dirtying his own hands. When I found out I was carrying your child, I thought God had sent me something no rich man could threaten out of me. I was wrong. Your father came himself then. He said if I told you he would destroy you first and me after. He said you believed you were infertile, and that if I appeared with a pregnancy, I would only look like a liar trying to trap a wounded man. He told me no one around you would ever let me near you again. Sadiq stopped reading. The office had gone completely silent except for the rain. He had to put the letter down because his hands were no longer steady. For years he had imagined betrayal in one direction only from Amina to him. Now he was being forced to look straight at the machinery that had operated in the opposite direction all along. Not just separation, humiliation, entrapment, strategic cruelty. He picked up the letter again. I should have fought harder. I know that. But I was afraid, Sadiq. Not for myself. For the baby. Men followed me twice before I left. Once near the market, once outside the room I was renting. After that, I ran before they could teach me how serious they were. I moved too often. I trusted too few people. I lied when I had to. I hated myself for disappearing without giving you the truth. But every version of the truth I could imagine ended with you bleeding from the war between your father's power and our small life. So I chose distance and called it protection. Maybe I was right. Maybe I was only weak. I no longer know. Sadiq pressed one fist against his mouth. Weak, no. Not weak. Terrified and alone, yes. Poor, hunted, cornered, pregnant, yes. But not weak. He continued. His name is Tendai. It means be thankful. I named him that on a morning when I had nothing in the room except one loaf of bread, a crying newborn, and the memory of you laughing during a storm. I wanted at least one thing in our life to begin with gratitude instead of fear. Despite everything, a broken sound escaped Sadiq's throat. Half laugh, half sob. That was Amina. Even in scarcity, still searching for meaning gentle enough to keep despair from becoming a home. He is blind, and for a long time I thought that meant I had failed him twice, first by bringing him into danger, and then by not giving him the world clearly enough to see. But he taught me something I was too proud to learn sooner. Sight is not the same as truth. He feels honesty faster than other people see it. He knows lies by the shape of a voice. Maybe that is why I always believed he would find you one day, even if I could not. Sadiq stared at those lines until they blurred. The ballroom, the first touch of Tendai's hand, the impossible certainty. He knows lies by the shape of a voice. Amina had known her son, completely. He turned to the last page. If you are reading this, then I am gone, and that hurts me more than I can write. Not because I am afraid to die. I have been afraid for so long that death has no proper face left in my mind. It hurts me because our son will stand in front of you carrying all the years I could not bridge, and I need you to understand this before anything else. He is innocent of every wound between us. Please do not let the sins of powerful people fall onto his small shoulders. Sadiq bowed his head. Rain moved down the glass behind him in silver lines. If you cannot love me any more, I understand. If grief made you hard, I understand that too. But love him. Even if you begin awkwardly. Even if you begin late. Love him honestly. Do not let him grow up wondering whether he was too much trouble to keep. His vision failed then. He wiped his eyes once and read the final paragraph through tears he no longer tried to hide. And one more truth, the one I kept because I thought time would give it back to us properly. I never betrayed you. I never stopped being yours in the quiet place of my heart. I only chose our son's survival over my own longing. If that was a sin, I will answer for it before God. But if mercy exists, then perhaps one day you will forgive me not for leaving, but for believing I had to. Amina. Sadiq remained motionless for a long time after finishing. The letter lay open on the desk. Amina's voice was everywhere now, in the room, in the rain, in the ache behind his ribs, in the memory of a future they had almost had. He had been wrong. Not about a detail, not about a misunderstanding. Wrong in the deepest way a man could be wrong about the woman he had once promised his life to. He had allowed grief to become accusation, allowed pride to become a grave where love was buried alive. And yet even now, even after everything done to her, Amina's final instinct had not been revenge. It had been protection. Love him honestly. Do not let him grow up wondering whether he was too much trouble to keep. Sadiq stood so abruptly his chair rolled back. He took the letter and went straight to the suite. Chipo opened the door before he knocked, startled by the urgency in his steps. He barely saw her. He crossed to the bed and sat beside his sleeping son. Tendai stirred. His eyes did not open, but his face turned toward the familiar sound. Dad, he murmured sleepily. The word nearly undid Sadiq all over again. Yes, he whispered. Tendai's hand searched the blanket until Sadiq took it. The child settled at once. Still half asleep, Tendai asked, "Did she write to you?" Sadiq looked down at him, stunned. Yes. A faint smile touched the boy's face. I told Auntie Chipo she would. Then, like a child, trusting the world just enough to surrender to sleep. Again, he whispered, Mama said, when truth gets tired of hiding, it comes home. Sadiq bent and kissed his son's forehead. His voice shook, but the promise inside it did not. It's home now. And in that moment, grief stopped being only grief. It became inheritance, a sacred duty. Not just to punish the guilty, but to become at last the father Amina had begged the world to let him be. 3 months later, the first rain of the new season came to Lagos just before dawn. It arrived softly at first, a silver whisper against the windows of the Diallo estate. Then steadier, fuller, until the whole city seemed wrapped in water and memory. The sound moved through the house like music. Sadiq was already awake. He had learned that fatherhood changed the architecture of a man's mornings. Once he had begun each day with market reports, security updates, and legal briefings. Now he began with smaller, holier things, the careful warming of milk, the checking of medication schedules, the feel of small socks in his hands, the listening for the quiet footstep of a boy, learning that home no longer meant temporary shelter. He stood in the kitchen in a simple dark sweater, sleeves rolled to the forearms, while the household staff tried and failed not to stare at him. 3 months ago, none of them had ever seen their employer preparing breakfast. Now they had learned not to comment. So the cook ventured carefully. I can do that. Sadiq smiled without looking up from the tray he was arranging. I know. That was all. He carried the tray himself. At the end of the corridor, Tendai's room was half open. It was no longer called the guest suite, not by Sadiq, not by Chipo, not by anyone who understood what the child had become inside this house. It was Tendai's room. The old fear had faded from it first. Then the silence of caution. Then the instinct to keep every belonging packed close, as if departure might come by sunset. In their place had come books in braille, tactile puzzles, soft shoes kicked carelessly under a chair, a half-built block tower near the rug, and the framed audio device of Rainfall that Sadiq had restored from the twin Stormwatch design Amina once loved. Tendai sat on the edge of the bed, fully dressed, listening to the weather, with his face tilted toward the open window. He did that often. He listened like some children looked. Dad, he said the moment Sadiq stepped in. It's stronger today. Sadiq set the tray down on the side table. The rain... Tendai nodded, smiling. Yes, it sounds happy. Sadiq crossed the room and rested a hand lightly on the boy's shoulder. 3 months, and he still had to steady himself sometimes at the simple fact of touch. That this small body belonged not to rumor or regret, but to his actual son. His son, who now reached for him without fear. His son who no longer asked each night if Sadiq would still be there in the morning. Yes, Sadiq said quietly. It does. Tendai lifted one hand. Can I hear the watch too? Sadiq took the old storm watch from his wrist and placed it gently in the boy's palm. Tendai pressed the hidden mechanism. Soft artificial rain blended with the real rain outside, and the child laughed a bright, warm sound that still startled Sadiq every time because it felt like sunlight entering rooms that had once known only discipline. It had not been an easy 3 months. Justice never was. Zahara's accounts had been frozen by court order within 48 hours of the board meeting. Khalil had fled first, then been found in Accra, trying to move funds through a private energy vehicle registered under another name. Bashir had turned state witness after realizing the evidence against him was not survivable. Charges followed. Asset recovery followed. More names emerged. Men who had smiled at Sadiq's table for years had quietly helped build a machine around his life, all while calling themselves protectors of family value and legacy. Then came the deeper wound. Sadiq had exhumed the past with lawyers' records, testimony, and old staff statements. Piece by piece, he reconstructed what his father had done. Letters intercepted, calls redirected, security memos buried, payments routed through discretionary household stabilization. Even after death, the old man's influence lingered in the habits of others, like a smell that would not leave the walls. Sadiq had burned through it all, not theatrically, not publicly beyond necessity. Exactly. His father's name had been removed from the children's wing he once funded for vanity. In its place now stood a new dedication under review, the Amina Bello Center for Pediatric Vision and Family Care. That had been Tendai's idea, though, in a child's simpler words. Mama should have a place where sick mothers are not afraid, he had said one evening while tracing the raised dots of a Braille alphabet page. Sadiq had turned away then because grief could still ambush him without warning. Now the center was nearly ready to open. And today mattered for another reason. At 10 in the morning, Tendai would be admitted for the first stage of an advanced treatment program, one that could not promise full sight, not honestly, but could offer something real. Possibility. Light perception first. Then, if his eyes responded well, corrective surgery and long rehabilitation. Sadiq had insisted on the best specialists on the continent. Tendai had insisted on something else. I want Chippo to hold one hand, he had said, and you to hold the other. So that was what would happen. At breakfast, Tendai ate slowly, pausing between bites to listen to the rain and ask questions that only children asked with such direct seriousness. Did Mama like mornings? Yes, Sadiq said. Did she sing badly like Chippo? Chippo, seated nearby with tea in both hands, gasped in mock offense. Tendai grinned. Sadiq almost laughed. Worse. That means I sing like family, Tendai declared. Chippo wiped her eyes, still laughing. She did that more now, too. The house had changed her. Or perhaps safety had. After breakfast, Sadiq helped Tendai into his coat himself. Not because no one else could do it. Because he wanted to. Because every ordinary act still felt like a returned treasure. As he fastened the buttons, Tendai touched his wrist. Are you scared? Sadiq paused. He had made himself a rule early in fatherhood, never lie when the truth could be carried without cruelty. Yes, he said. Tendai nodded thoughtfully. Me too. Sadiq finished the last button. Then we can be scared together. The child reached up and touched his face with both hands, mapping jaw, cheek, brow in the careful way that had become his version of looking. You sound less angry now, Tendai said. Sadiq held still. Is that good? He asked. Tendai smiled. It means your heart is not lonely all the time. 3 months ago, words like that would have cut. Now they healed. At the hospital, the private entrance had been secured, but Sadiq refused excessive spectacle. No press, no grand announcements, no performance of generosity. Tendai was not a campaign. He was a child on his way to treatment. The lead surgeon, Dr. Naledi Mensah, greeted them with professional warmth. She spoke first to Tendai, not over him, which earned his instant trust. We will explain everything before we do anything, she said. Tendai nodded seriously. Good. I do not like surprises unless they are cake. Even Dr. Mensah laughed at that. The pre-op room was painted in calm colors, with animal shapes embossed on the walls, so children with limited sight or total blindness could feel the patterns. Sadiq noticed everything now in places like this, not because he had become sentimental, but because love trained attention. As the nurses prepared the first treatment line, Tendai's courage flickered for the first time. His fingers tightened around the blanket. Dad, I'm here. You will still be here when I wake up. The old question. Smaller now, softer, but still present at the edges of his healing. Sadiq bent and pressed his forehead gently to Tendai's. "When you wake up," he said, "I will be the first voice you hear." Tendai breathed out slowly. "Promise, promise." The medication made the child drowsy quickly. Chipo stroked his hair and whispered a prayer. Sadiq stayed exactly where he had said he would, one hand wrapped around Tendai's. When the boy finally slipped into sedation, Sadiq remained seated long after the nurses asked if he wanted coffee water. Air, anything. He wanted none of those things. He wanted time back. He wanted Amina alive. He wanted 8 stolen years returned intact. But life did not negotiate that way. Healing, he had learned, was not the recovery of what should have been. It was the sacred labor of loving what remained so fully that the wound could no longer define the whole story. Hours later, when Tendai stirred in recovery, his eyelids fluttering beneath protective dressing, Sadiq leaned forward at once. The child's lips moved. Dad Sadiq took his hand. "I'm here." Tendai smiled weakly. "I knew it." The words were simple, familiar. Almost the same words he had once said in that shattered ballroom when everything began. But now they meant something different. Not hope against uncertainty, certainty after suffering. Weeks later, after successful treatment progression and the first carefully managed removal of part of the dressing, Tendai sat in a quiet consultation room between Sadiq and Chipo. Dr. Mensah had been honest. Clarity would come slowly, imperfectly, with therapy and time. But there was response. Light, shape, movement, a beginning. "Ready?" the doctor asked. Tendai swallowed and nodded. The final layer was lifted. The room held its breath. Tendai blinked hard against the brightness, confused and amazed all at once. His eyes watered, his face twisted in effort. Then he turned toward the nearest dark shape, toward Sadiq. He could not yet see detail clearly, not fully, but he could see enough. A tall outline, broad shoulders, a stillness he already knew by heartbeat and voice and touch. Slowly, shakily, Tendai raised his hands to Sadiq's face, just as he always had. Fingers touched brow, cheek, beard, mouth. Then the boy let out a breath that sounded half like wonder and half like recognition. "I knew it was you," he whispered. Sadiq closed his eyes, not because he could not bear the moment, because he finally could. He gathered Tendai into his arms as Chipo wept beside them and the rain began again outside the hospital windows, soft and steady and full of mercy. Some families were built by celebration. Theirs had been built by survival, truth, justice, and the stubborn refusal of love to die even when powerful people tried to bury it. And as Sadiq held his son, he understood at last that fatherhood had not begun the day DNA proved blood. It had begun the moment he chose not to look away from pain. The rest of his life would be spent honoring that choice. Some of the deepest wounds in life are not caused by strangers, but by the people who had the most power to protect us and chose control instead of love. This story reminds us that truth can be buried for years, but it rarely dies. Sooner or later it rises through a child's voice, through a forgotten letter, through the quiet courage of someone who refuses to stop believing. Sadiq lost years to lies, pride, and manipulation. Amina lost her chance to be understood while she was alive. Tendai lost the simple safety every child deserves. And yet even after so much pain, love still found its way back. That is the real miracle of this story. Not wealth, not DNA, not revenge, but the fact that a broken father learned how to become gentle, and a wounded child still found the strength to trust. Life will not always give us back the years that were stolen. but it can still give us the chance to choose what kind of people we become after the truth is revealed. We can become bitter, or we can become brave. We can repeat the cruelty that hurt us, or we can become the healing someone else once prayed for. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments and tell me which moment moved you the most. And if you love powerful, emotional stories about truth, justice, and healing, subscribe to the